Good evening, and welcome back to the Sleepy Archive. Tonight, there is no need to do anything at all. You don't need to remember the dates. You don't need to follow every detail. This is history told slowly, the kind you're allowed to fall asleep to. So settle in. Let your shoulders sink into the bed. Let your breathing slow down. Tonight, we're going to spend the night with what a medieval pilgrimage was really like. We'll walk, very slowly, beside one woman who left her English village on foot, carrying almost nothing, bound for a shrine hundreds of miles away, and we'll follow the long, uneventful road that got her there, and the longer road that brought her home again. Whenever you're ready, close your eyes. Let's begin. It is the autumn of the year 1370, in a small wool trade village in the west of England. Marjorie is a merchant's widow of 46, and tonight, by the light of a single tallow candle, she is folding a grey wool kirtle into a canvas bundle on the floor of her own bedchamber. Her hands move slowly, without hurry, the way hands move when a decision has already been made, and only the doing of it remains. Outside, the shutters rattle faintly in a rising wind, and somewhere down the lane, a dog barks twice and falls silent again. She had been ill the winter before last, a fever that kept her bedridden through January and into February, the kind of fever that made the priest come twice to sit with her, the kind that made her own breath sound strange to her in the dark. She had promised, somewhere in the worst of those nights, that if she rose from that bed, she would walk to the shrine of St. James in the far west of Spain and give thanks in person. She rose, and now, a year and a half later, the promise has come due. She packs slowly, a second shift folded small, a pair of stout woolen hose, a small leather scrip that will hang from her belt for bread and a little coin, a wooden bowl, a horn spoon. She sets a wooden staff against the wall, taller than her shoulder, its foot already worn smooth by some previous journey she does not know the history of, bought from a tinker at the autumn fair, second-hand, unremarkable. Her late husband's ledger books sit closed on the shelf across the room, dust already gathering faintly along their spines. She will leave the shop shuttered. A cousin will keep an eye on the house. There is nothing more, really, to arrange. The candle gutters once in the draught from the window and steadies again. Tomorrow, before the sun is properly up, she will walk out of this room, out of this house, out of this village, and she will not come back to it for the better part of a year. Tonight, there is only the folding of cloth, the quiet of the house settling around her, and the candle burning low and even in the dark. The village is called Wistanton, though the name will mean nothing to you, and it means little enough even now, 700 years later. It is a small place built on wool. A single muddy lane runs its length, lined with low timber-framed houses, their upper stories leaning slightly toward each other over the street. Smoke rises from a dozen chimneys into a grey morning sky. Sheep graze the common fields beyond the last house, dulled by distance to soft pale smudges against the green. Marjorie's house stands near the centre of the lane, its ground floor given over to her late husband's cloth trade. Bolts of undyed wool once stacked along the walls, now sold off or stored with a cousin, the shop front shuttered and quiet. The village runs on a rhythm as old as anyone living can remember. The bell of the squat stone parish church marks the hours of prayer, and the villagers shape their day loosely around it, rising with the light, working the fields or the looms until it fades, gathering in the evening around low fires that smell of wood smoke and damp wool. Word of Marjorie's vow has moved through Wistanton the way such things move through a small place. Quietly, but completely, everyone knows. No one thinks it strange exactly, though a few of the older women shake their heads at the distance of it, at a widow of her years, walking alone into lands she cannot picture. It was not, in her century, a rare thing to do. Pilgrimage was woven into the ordinary fabric of medieval life, a way to give thanks, a way to ask for healing, a way to do penance for some private wrong, a way, sometimes, simply to see something of the wider world that a village like Wistanton could never show you. 3 shrines stood above all others in the imagination of people like her: Jerusalem, farthest and hardest to reach; Rome, seat of St. Peter; and Compostela, in the far corner of Spain, where the bones of St. James the Apostle were said to rest. For a widow of modest means, with no great fortune to spend on the sea route to Jerusalem, Compostela was the shrine within reach. Long-established roads led there. Other English pilgrims had walked them before her and come home again to tell of it. The wool trade itself had shaped Wistanton's whole understanding of distance. Bales of the village's fleece travelled, every season, to markets Marjorie herself had never seen, to buyers in towns whose names she knew only from her husband's ledgers, carried there by carters and pack trains along roads not so very different from the one she is about to walk herself. In that sense, the village already half understood what she was undertaking, even if none of them had done quite this particular version of it. Wool went out from Wistanton every year and came back as coin. A woman might, it seemed, go out from Wistanton once in a lifetime and come back changed in some quieter way that no ledger could record. The older women who shook their heads at her plan were not, in truth, questioning the vow itself. A vow was a vow, sacred and binding, not lightly set aside once made. What troubled them was simpler and more practical, the sheer distance of it, weeks upon weeks of unfamiliar road, a widow travelling largely on her own good sense, and whatever company the road happened to offer. The bell of the parish church begins to ring for the first office of the day, its sound rolling low and steady over the wet thatch and the waking fields, and somewhere in the timber-framed house near the centre of the lane, Marjorie is already awake and already dressed. Father Oldhelm is waiting for her at the low arched door of the parish church, his cassock dark against the pale stone, a small missal held closed in one spotted hand. He has been the priest of Wistanton for as long as Marjorie has been alive in it, a stooped, gentle man, now well past 50, his tonsure gone entirely to white. She kneels on the worn stone step before him, her staff and bundle set down beside her, her hands folded. He speaks the blessing slowly. In Latin, she only half follows, and English she follows entirely. A prayer for safe roads, for shelter found when night comes down, for protection from thieves and from the sickness of strange water, for a safe and thankful return. He sprinkles a little holy water over her bowed head, over the staff lying at her feet, over the small leather scrip at her hip. A handful of neighbours have gathered at the churchyard gate to see her off. Not a crowd, just a handful, the way a small village sends off one of its own. An old woman presses a wrapped heel of bread into her hands. A boy stares at her staff as though it were a soldier's sword. This departure, the blessing at the church door, the sprinkled water, the small crowd at the gate, was, for a medieval traveller, no mere sentiment. A pilgrimage was understood as a spiritual undertaking from its very first step, and the church's blessing marked the ordinary road ahead as something set apart, something undertaken with God's particular notice. Marjorie rises from the step. Father Oldhelm presses something small into her palm. A coin, worn thin, more token than some. For the shrine, he says. Not for the road. God will provide for the road. She thanks him, and does not know quite what else to say, and so says nothing else. The bell has gone quiet now. The little crowd at the gate begins, awkwardly, to disperse, back to their looms, their fields, their ordinary Tuesday. Marjorie lifts her staff, settles her bundle across her shoulder, and turns her face toward the lane that leads out of Wistanton, toward the road that will, in time, though not for many weeks yet, lead her to the sea. Why did people undertake journeys like this at all, in an age when the roads were slow and uncertain, and the world beyond one's own village was, for most, entirely unknown? The reasons were rarely single. Some went, as Marjorie goes now, in thanksgiving, for a recovery from illness, a promise made in a fever, honoured once the fever had passed. Some went in penance, sent by a priest or a court to walk a long road as punishment for some wrong, the distance itself a kind of correction. Some went simply hoping for a cure not yet granted, a bad leg, failing eyes, a lung that would not clear, carried to a shrine in the hope that proximity to holiness might do what physicians could not. And some, it must be said honestly, went for reasons closer to curiosity than devotion, a chance, however costly, to see distant country, to walk among strangers, to have a story to tell afterward that no one at home could quite match. The church did not much distinguish between these motives. A pilgrim was a pilgrim, whatever had set the boots moving. Proof of the journey mattered, in a world with no other way to verify where a person had been. At each of the great shrines, pilgrims collected a token, a small badge, cheaply cast in lead or pewter, sold openly near the shrine itself, and pinned to a hat or cloak for the walk home. At Compostela, that badge was the scallop shell, plain, sea-worn, gathered in enormous numbers from the nearby shore and sold to pilgrims by the thousand, or cast in metal for those who wanted something that would last the journey home. Marjorie does not yet have a shell. She will not earn one, in the honest sense of it, until she has walked the whole distance, and stood before the shrine itself. For now she has only the staff, the scrip, the worn coin from Father Aldhelm, and the long grey road unrolling ahead of her past the last house of Wistanton, past the sheep grazing dully on the common, toward a horizon she has never in her life had reason to look at closely before. There was, in truth, very little that a pilgrim like Marjorie could carry, and a great deal that she had, instead, to arrange. Money was the first difficulty. Coin was heavy, and carrying too visible a sum invited theft on a lonely stretch of road. Marjorie has sewn a portion of hers into a narrow belt worn beneath her kirtle, against her skin, where a thief's quick hand would not think to look, and carries only a little loose in the scrip at her hip, enough for bread and a night's lodging, no more. A letter would have helped her too, in principle. Some pilgrims of higher standing travelled with a letter from their own priest or lord, testifying to who they were and what their errand was, useful at a town gate or a suspicious innkeeper's door. Marjorie has only Father Aldhelm's word, spoken aloud to the handful of neighbours at the gate, that this is indeed a woman walking to Compostela, and not a woman walking away from something. Her shoes matter more than almost anything else she owns tonight. Stout, well-soled, broken in over months rather than days. A pilgrim who set out in new shoes was, by every account of the road, asking for blistered feet within the first week. She carries no extra clothing beyond the single change already folded into her bundle. Weight is the enemy of distance, and distance is the entire shape of what lies ahead of her. There is a custom, too, in villages like Wistanton, of the departing pilgrim being commended aloud before the whole parish, not merely blessed in private, but named, so that the community itself becomes a kind of witness, obliged in turn to remember her in its own prayers while she is gone. She had been named so the Sunday before, from the step of the church, and had stood through it with her eyes lowered, uncertain whether to feel comforted or exposed. Now there is nothing left to arrange. The belt is sewn, the shoes are broken in, the staff is in her hand. She had thought, in the weeks of preparing, that the hardest part might be the arranging itself, the money, the shoes, the letter she does not have, the long list of small practical decisions that stood between the vow spoken in a fever and the vow finally kept on the road. It had not turned out that way. The arranging, once begun, had gone quickly enough. It was the waiting, in the days just before departure, that had felt longest. A neighbour woman had asked her, only the evening before, whether she was afraid, and Marjorie had found she did not have a simple answer ready. Afraid of the road, perhaps, in some ordinary sense, of weather, of tiredness, of strange food and stranger beds. Not afraid particularly of the vow itself, or of what waited at the far end of it. That part felt, if anything, like the one solid thing in the whole undertaking. The lane out of Wistanton runs on a little further, past the last shuttered house, past a leaning wayside cross where the road forks, and then simply becomes the wider world, indifferent and enormous, waiting for her to walk into it. The last night in her own bed passes slowly, in the particular way that a night passes when sleep keeps almost arriving and then drawing back again. Marjorie lies still beneath a woolen blanket gone thin with years of washing, listening to the house settle around her, a beam ticking somewhere in the roof as it cools, a mouse somewhere behind the wall, the wind finding the gap beneath the shutter and worrying at it without ever quite getting in. She thinks, without meaning to, of her husband, dead now these 4 years, of the shape he used to make beside her in this same bed, of the particular quiet a house keeps once that shape is gone from it. She thinks of the fever, of the ceiling beams swimming above her in the candlelight, of the promise made somewhere in the worst hour of it, half to God and half, if she is honest, simply to the dark. She thinks, briefly, of the distance, of a map she has never seen but has heard described, England to the sea to France, France down through Gascony toward the mountains, and the mountains somehow giving way at last to Spain, and Spain unrolling for what she is told is another month of walking before the shrine itself appears. It is, she tells herself, only one step after another. No single day of it will be more than a person can walk. The candle has long since been snuffed. A thin grey line has begun, almost imperceptibly, to show itself along the top edge of the shutter. Somewhere past the wall, a cock crows once, uncertainly, testing the dark before committing to the morning. She rises before the light is fully up, dresses in the dim grey of pre-dawn, and moves through the quiet house one last time, touching, without quite meaning to, the doorframe, the cold hearthstone, the closed ledger books on their shelf. The lane is empty at this hour, the other houses of Wistons still shuttered and dark, smoke only just beginning to thread up from the earliest risen chimneys. Her staff sounds softly against the packed earth of the lane with each step, a small steady knock that will, she suspects, become the whole rhythm of the coming months. At the edge of the village she stops, once, and looks back, the low roofline of the houses, the squat stone tower of the church rising just above them, a single thread of smoke going up from what she thinks may be her own cousin's chimney. She does not look back a second time. The road beyond Wystonton runs flat and pale through the early light, hedgerows dark on either side, the grass along the verge still silvered with the night's dew. Marjorie walks on, alone for now, her staff finding its rhythm, the village already smaller behind her than it feels it should be, after everything. The morning mist is beginning to lift off the low fields, and somewhere ahead, though she cannot yet see it, the road bends toward the coast, and the sea, and the whole long unknown distance, still waiting to be walked. And so we leave her there, on the quiet morning road out of her village. But the road is long, and there is a great deal more of it to walk. Let's follow Marjorie a little further into what a medieval pilgrimage was really like, onto the open road itself, where she will not, for very much longer, be walking alone. No need to sit up, just keep listening. Some 10 days out from Wystonton, the coast long behind her and the crossing to France already made, Marjorie falls in, almost without meaning to, with two other travelers going the same way. The first is Thomas, an old farmer, well past 60. His brown wool tunic hung about with small badges of lead and pewter, and a scattering of pale, sea-worn shells. Proof, though he needs none, that this is not his first such road. He has been, he tells her plainly, to Rome twice and to Jerusalem once, in years now well behind him, and Compostela, he says, is by comparison an easy walk. The second is Will, a thin young clerk of about 22, his shoulders narrow beneath a threadbare grey tunic, a small satchel of books slung awkwardly across his back. He coughs from time to time, a dry catch in the chest that seems to trouble him more in the cold mornings, and admits, when asked directly, that he walks this road hoping the shrine might do for his weak lungs what physicians in his own town could not. The three of them settle, without much discussion, into a loose company for the road ahead, not from any deep acquaintance, but from the plain good sense of it. Three walking together are safer than one walking alone, and the miles pass, Thomas says, a little easier with someone to talk them past. He falls into step beside Marjorie's slower pace, matching it without comment, and begins, unprompted, to tell her of Rome, the crowds, the heat, the 7 great churches a pilgrim was expected to visit in turn. Will walks a little behind, saving his breath for the walking rather than the talking, though he listens closely enough to Thomas's stories, and asks, now and again, a quiet question of his own. The road ahead of them runs on through unfamiliar country, hedgerows giving way in places to open fields, a distant church spire marking the next town they will pass, but not yet enter. Marjorie finds, somewhat to her own surprise, that the company steadies her more than she had expected it might. The road had felt, alone, like an enormous and faintly frightening thing. Walked beside 2 others, it becomes, simply, a road. The roads that carried pilgrims like Marjorie across medieval Europe were not built for pilgrimage at all. They were the ordinary roads of trade and travel, the same rutted tracks used by merchants, drovers, and messengers, worn down over centuries by cart and hoof and boot alike. What made them pilgrim roads was custom and marking and the slow accumulation of habit. At crossroads and town gates, simple stone crosses were raised, weathered and lichen-spotted, offering travelers a place to pause and pray before choosing their direction. Milestone crosses marked the distance already covered and the distance still owed. Safety, such as it was, came chiefly from numbers. A lone traveller on an empty stretch of road was a target for whatever thieves the local woods concealed. A company of several pilgrims, staffs in hand, was a far less appealing prospect, and most travellers of the age arranged themselves into such loose companies wherever the road allowed it, falling in with strangers at a river crossing or a town gate, parting again days or weeks later when their paths diverged. The route Marjorie now walks was, by her century, a well-worn one, part of a network of roads converging from many directions across France upon the mountains that separated France from Spain, and beyond those mountains upon the shrine itself. Guidebooks existed for it, of a kind, copied and passed hand to hand among clergy and the more literate pilgrims, describing the towns along the way, the quality of the water, the shrines worth a small detour. Villages and towns along these roads had, over generations, learned to expect pilgrims and to profit modestly from their passing. A baker who sold an extra loaf, an innkeeper who kept a spare pallet, a cobbler who mended a worn sole for a few coins. The roads varied greatly in quality along their length. Nearer the larger towns, some stretches had been laid, generations before, with rough paving stones, worn smooth and slightly hollowed by centuries of cartwheels and foot traffic. Further into the open countryside, the road was often little more than beaten earth, dust in dry weather, and thick, clinging mud after rain. Its exact course sometimes shifting slightly year to year as travelers skirted the worst of a rutted stretch. River crossings presented their own small ceremony of delay. Where no bridge stood, a ferryman or a shallow ford served instead, and pilgrims without much coin to spare often waited, patiently, for a cart or a wealthier traveller willing to share the cost of the crossing, or simply removed their shoes and waded, staff in hand, testing the riverbed for hidden stones. For Marjorie, Thomas, and Will, this particular afternoon stretch of road runs between open, ordinary fields, a scattering of other travellers passed and greeted and left behind, a distant church spire drawing slowly nearer with every hour of walking, and, somewhere far ahead of all of them, though none of the three speaks of it yet, the first grey suggestion of mountains still many weeks away. The days on the road settle, within a week or so, into a rhythm as steady and unremarkable as breathing. They rise before full light, walk through the cool of the morning while the legs are fresh, rest briefly at midday when the sun is highest and the heat, on clear days, presses down hardest on the open road. They walk on through the long, slow afternoon and stop, most days, an hour or two before dark to find whatever shelter the day's stretch of road has to offer. Marjorie's feet, in the first days, had ached badly by evening, a dull, deep throb through the arch and heel that made the last mile of each day feel longer than all the miles before it. By the second week, the ache has dulled into something closer to habit, her feet toughening in the way that a road, given time, toughens every pair of feet that walks it long enough. Her staff has become, without her quite noticing the change, an extension of her own arm, planted ahead with each stride, taking a portion of her weight on the uneven ground, steadying her on the loose stones of a riverbank or the slick mud after rain. Thomas walks at a pace that looks, to Marjorie's eye, almost lazy, and yet somehow covers exactly as much ground by evening as her own more determined stride. He has done this, she reminds herself, many times before. His body has long since learned the arithmetic of a long road that hers is only now beginning to learn. Will struggles more. His cough worsens in the cold mornings, eases somewhat by midday, and he walks, most afternoons, with a kind of set, quiet endurance that neither Marjorie nor Thomas remarks upon aloud. They speak little while walking, a comment on the weather, a question about the next town, long stretches of comfortable silence, broken only by the small steady knock of two staffs against the dirt, and the softer, uneven fall of Will's feet a pace or two behind. The land around them changes slowly, field giving way to woodland giving way to field again. The sameness of it, oddly, more restful than tedious. Nothing sudden, nothing demanding attention, only the road, and the walking, and the day's light moving slowly from east to west above them. What exactly did a journey like this cost, and how did an ordinary pilgrim manage to pay for months on the road? The honest answer is that it cost more than most could easily spare, and pilgrims of Marjorie's modest means travelled accordingly, cheaply, sparingly, and often at the edge of what their purse could bear. Lodging, where it could not be found for free at a monastery or hospice, cost a few small coins a night for a shared pallet in a rough inn, often no more than straw, on a floor already crowded with other travellers. Bread, cheese, and thin wine or ale made up the greater part of most pilgrims' meals. Meat was a luxury rarely afforded on the road, saved, if at all, for a feast day or a moment of particular need. Some pilgrims of greater means carried letters of credit, arrangements with merchant houses along the route that allowed them to draw funds without carrying the full sum in coin across dangerous country. Marjorie has no such arrangement, only the coin sewn into her belt, doled out carefully, day by day, against what she judges the road still owes her before Compostela. The badge, when finally earned at the shrine itself, served a purpose beyond simple memory. A pilgrim returning home wearing the scallop of Compostela or the crossed keys of Rome was recognizable at a glance as one who had completed a holy journey, entitled, by custom in many places, to a measure of charity and hospitality along the road home that an ordinary traveller could not claim. It was, in its way, medieval Europe's nearest thing to a passport, a small cast token that told any stranger who saw it exactly where its wearer had been, and why they deserved, for a night at least, a share of someone else's fire and someone else's bread. Marjorie has none yet, for now she is simply a woman walking, indistinguishable at a glance from any other traveller on the road, her claim to the journey resting on nothing more than her own word and Thomas's vouching for her. The three of them pass, this particular evening, a small wayside shrine, tucked into a hedge, a rough stone niche, holding a worn, weathered figure of a saint, whose name none of them can quite make out, and Thomas, without breaking stride, murmurs a short prayer to it out of long habit, the way another traveller might nod to a familiar landmark. In the evenings, when the day's walking is done, and a fire, however small, has been found or built, Thomas talks, and Marjorie and Will listen. He tells them of Rome as he remembers it from decades past, the sheer size of it after a lifetime in small English towns, the 7 churches a pilgrim was expected to visit, the crush of other travellers from every corner of Christendom, all converging on the same handful of holy sites. He tells them, more quietly, of Jerusalem, the sea voyage that frightened him more than any stretch of road ever had, the strange heat, the strangeness of a land where his own language was of no use to him at all. He does not dwell long on any of it. These are, Marjorie comes to understand, well-worn stories, told many times before, to many other companions, on many other stretches of road, smoothed by repetition into something closer to ritual than memory. Will asks him one evening whether the shrines had done what he'd hoped, whether Rome or Jerusalem had changed anything in him that a lifetime in his own village could not have changed. Thomas considers this longer than he considers most questions. The rest I couldn't tell you for certain. Will nods and says nothing further, and looks for a long moment into the small fire, and Marjorie understands, without either of them saying so directly, that he is thinking of his own lungs and his own hoped-for cure, and wondering, quietly, what Compostela will and will not be able to do for him. Marjorie asks Thomas, after a while, how he had first come to walk such roads at all, and he tells her, unhurried, of a younger self she finds it faintly hard to picture beneath the white beard and the weathered face, a wool-comber's son with restless feet and no trade of his own that suited him, who had first walked to Canterbury on a whim scarcely older than a boy's dare, and found, somewhere on that short and modest road, a taste for distance that had never quite left him since. It isn't every year, he admits, when Will asks whether he means to keep walking such roads forever. The body asks less of you when you're 30 than when you're past 60, but the road doesn't much care how old a man is once he's on it. It only asks that he keep walking. The fire burns low between them. Somewhere beyond the small circle of its light, an owl calls once, and is answered, faintly, from further off. None of the three says much more that evening. There is, after a day's walking, very little left in any of them for talk, only the fire, and the food already eaten, and the road waiting, patient and unhurried for the morning. They have found, this particular night, no proper shelter, only a wide hedge, offering some little break from the wind, and a fire built small and careful against the damp of the grass. Marjorie lies wrapped in her thin blanket, her staff laid within reach beside her, watching the last of the flames settle into a bed of orange embers. Thomas is already asleep, or near enough to it, his breathing slow and even, one weathered hand still resting near the badges sewn across his tunic, as though even in sleep he keeps some small watch over them. Will coughs once, softly, into the crook of his arm, and settles again, and does not cough a second time. Above them, where the hedge does not block the sky, a scattering of stars has come out, cold and very distant, indifferent entirely to three tired travellers and their small dying fire. Marjorie finds herself thinking, before sleep finally takes her, of Wistanton, of her own bed, her own hearth, the particular quiet a familiar house keeps at night, and finds, to her mild surprise, that the thought no longer aches quite as sharply as it did on the first night out. The road, it seems, is beginning, very slowly, to become its own kind of home. Morning comes grey and slow, the fire long since gone to cold ash, dew heavy on the blanket and on the grass all around them. They rise stiffly, one after another, and eat what little remains of yesterday's bread in near silence, watching the mist lift slowly off the fields beyond the hedge. Will's cough is worse this morning, as it always is in the cold, but he says nothing of it, and shoulders his satchel, and falls into step behind the other two as the road resumes. The road ahead climbs, very gently, toward a low ridge, beyond which, Thomas says, lies the next town, and a proper bed, and something warm to eat. Marjorie walks on, her staff finding its rhythm again, the ache in her feet by now familiar enough to ignore, the company of the other two settling around her like a second, quieter kind of home. And so we leave the three of them there, on the road toward the next town. But the night is long, and there is more of it to wander through. Let's drift a little further into what a medieval pilgrimage was really like, to a place built, on purpose, to shelter travelers exactly like them. No need to sit up, just keep listening. The road brings them, some weeks further on, to the gatehouse of a wayside abbey, its great iron-studded door standing dark against pale stone in the last grey light of a cold afternoon. Brother Osmond, the porter, opens to Thomas's knock, a stout monk well into his 50s, his tonsure ringed with grey, a heavy ring of iron keys hanging at his rope belt. He has clearly opened this same door to countless pilgrims before them, and asks only the plainest of questions, before waving them through, how many, how far travelled, whether any among them are ill. Will's cough answers that last question before he can. Brother Osmond leads them across a bare stone yard, past the low arches of the cloister, to a plain whitewashed building set apart for guests, the Pilgrim's Hospice, its single long room lined with straw pallets, a modest fire already burning at one end. He speaks little as he shows them where to lay their bundles, but his manner carries no impatience at all, no sense that three more travellers are any burden upon him, only the calm, practiced welcome of a man who has done this same small task 10,000 times. Marjorie lowers herself onto the straw pallet nearest the fire, feeling, for the first time in what feels like weeks, the particular relief of a wall at her back and a roof, solid and unmoving, above her head. A great stone trough stands near the door, filled with water gone lukewarm from a kettle set beside it, for the washing of feet, Brother Osmond explains, before the pilgrims sit down to eat. It is, he says, an old custom of the house, older than his own memory of it, a small echo of an older, holier washing that none of them need him to name aloud. Will sits on the edge of his pallet and eases his worn shoes from his feet with a low groan of relief, and Marjorie does the same, and for a while none of the three of them speaks at all, only the fire, crackling low and steady, and the distant, muffled sound of monks somewhere beyond the wall, moving through some office of their day that has nothing at all to do with the three tired strangers now resting beneath their roof. Monasteries across medieval Europe kept, as a matter of religious obligation rather than simple charity, a standing duty to receive travellers. The rule by which most such houses lived required that any guest arriving at the gate be welcomed as though welcoming Christ himself. This was no small undertaking, repeated as it was, night after night, in houses along every well-travelled pilgrim route across the continent. A guest master or porter, like Brother Osmond, was appointed specifically to this task, to greet arrivals, to see them fed and sheltered, to tend, where necessary, to the sick among them. The hospice building itself stood usually a little apart from the monks' own quarters, plain and unadorned compared to the church or cloister, built for function rather than beauty, straw pallets in rows, a shared hearth, a long table for the evening meal, little more. Meals for guests followed loosely, the same rhythm as the monk's own table. Simple pottage, coarse bread, weak ale or watered wine, eaten without much ceremony, often in near silence, out of respect for the house's own custom of quiet at mealtimes. For a pilgrim like Marjorie, such houses were not merely convenient. They were, on certain stretches of road, the only reliable shelter to be found at all, spaced out along the route, roughly a day's walk apart, so that a pilgrim keeping to the road need rarely go a night without some roof over their head. The washing of a guest's feet, offered here as elsewhere along the road, echoed a gesture recorded in Scripture itself, and monastic houses took a quiet pride in performing it without complaint, whatever the state of the feet in question. The abbey's own daily round shaped itself around a cycle of prayer stretching from well before dawn until well after dark, a rhythm of bells that had nothing to do with the pilgrims sheltering beneath its roof, and yet touched them constantly all the same, marking, without their needing a clock, roughly how much of the night had passed and how much remained. Guest houses of this kind varied considerably in size and comfort from one abbey to the next. A wealthier house, well endowed by generous patrons, might keep a hospice with its own kitchen, its own modest infirmary, even separate quarters for guests of higher standing travelling with servants of their own. A smaller or poorer house offered less. A single shared hall, a single hearth, whatever plain fare the kitchen could spare that particular evening, but rarely turned a genuine pilgrim away entirely, whatever the house's own means. Outside the hospice, beyond the low wall of the yard, the wider abbey continues its own unbroken rhythm, bells marking the hours, monks moving between church and cloister and refectory in their long dark habits, entirely unconcerned, on the surface of it, with the three tired travellers now warming themselves by a borrowed fire, and yet entirely responsible, by their own rule and their own custom, for making sure that fire was there at all. Brother Osmond returns as the light fails fully outside, carrying a wooden bucket and a stack of coarse linen cloths, and kneels, without ceremony, to help the newest and most tired-looking of the arrivals with the washing of their feet. Marjorie protests, softly, that she is well able to manage it herself, and he waves the protest away with the same unbothered calm he has shown since the gate. "It is the house's custom," he says simply, "not a favor to you in particular." The water is lukewarm and gentle on feet gone raw in places from weeks of walking, and Marjorie finds herself, unexpectedly, blinking back something close to tears at the plainness of the kindness in it. Will's feet, when his turn comes, show the marks of the road more sharply than either of the others. A blister burst and healing badly along one heel, the skin gone thin and pale from the damp of the last few days' rain. Brother Osmond examines it without comment, cleans it carefully, and binds it in a strip of clean linen, murmuring something about rest and dry socks, and perhaps a full day here before moving on, if the road allows it. The straw pallets, once feet are washed and shoes set aside to dry near the fire, prove softer than Marjorie expected. Not soft exactly, but enough, after weeks of hedgerows and hard-packed roadside earth, to feel almost luxurious. A bell somewhere across the yard begins to toll, slow and even, marking some office of the monk's own day that has nothing to do with the pilgrims resting here, and Brother Osmond rises at the sound of it, gathers his bucket and his cloths, and takes his leave with a final word that supper will be brought shortly, and that they are welcome to rest exactly as long as the house can spare the space. Supper, when it comes, is simple almost to the point of plainness. A thin pottage of beans and onion, a round of coarse dark bread, a small cup of watered wine passed without much comment down the long refectory table. The monks themselves eat in a separate hall, in the near total silence their own rule demands. One brother reading aloud from a devotional text, while the others eat without speaking, a custom Marjorie finds, when Brother Osmond explains it to her, faintly strange and faintly restful in equal measure. The pilgrim's table keeps a gentler version of that same quiet, not silent exactly, but subdued, voices kept low out of some unspoken sense that loud talk would sit wrong within these particular walls. Marjorie eats slowly, savouring the plain warmth of the pottage more than she might have thought possible a month ago, when such fare would have seemed thin fare indeed compared to her own table back in Wistanton. Will eats less than the others, his appetite dulled by the day's exhaustion and by the dull ache of his bound heel, but finishes what is set before him, and thanks Brother Osmond quietly when the bowl is cleared away. Thomas eats with the unhurried ease of a man for whom this exact meal, in some near-identical hall, has been repeated more times than he could easily count across 3 long pilgrimages. Around them, at the long table, sit other travellers besides their own small company. A merchant bound for a trade fair further south, a knight travelling, he says little of it, on some private matter of penance laid on him by his own confessor, a pair of younger pilgrims bound, like Marjorie, for Compostela itself. The talk that does pass, quiet and unhurried, moves between them, a comment on the state of the roads ahead, a warning about a stretch of forest known for thieves, a rumour of snow already fallen early in the mountains, still some weeks ahead of all of them. Marjorie listens more than she speaks, gathering what she can of the road still to come, and finds the plain bread and the thin pottage, eaten in this quiet company beneath this borrowed roof, more satisfying than she has any easy way to explain. After the meal is cleared, the pilgrims linger a while by the hospice fire before retiring to their pallets, the day's walking finally catching up with all of them in the particular heaviness that settles into legs once they are, at last, allowed to stop. The night, prompted gently by Thomas, speaks a little more of his own journey, a penance, he admits at last, for some sin he does not name, laid on him by a confessor who judged that a long road walked in humility would do more for his soul than any shorter punishment closer to home. He does not seem to resent the sentence. If anything, he seems, this many weeks into it, almost grateful for the plainness it has forced upon him. No servants here, no fine hall, only the same straw pallet and thin pottage as any other traveller passing through. The merchant speaks briefly of the trade fair ahead of him, of cloth prices, of a route he knows well from a dozen previous journeys, offering, unprompted, some practical advice on which towns ahead keep honest innkeepers and which do not. The two younger pilgrims, bound like Marjorie for Compostela, ask Thomas eagerly what lies ahead of them in the mountains, and he answers with the same unhurried calm he answers everything, neither alarming them nor pretending the crossing will be easy. Will sits a little apart from the talk, his bound foot propped near the fire, listening more than speaking, his breath still catching now and then in his chest, despite the warmth of the room. Marjorie watches the fire more than she watches the company, feeling, in this borrowed hall among strangers who will scatter again within days, a strange and unexpected sense of belonging, not to any of them individually, but to the shape of the journey itself, shared, for this one evening, by everyone at this table. She thinks, watching the knight's quiet, unresentful acceptance of his own long penance, of the very different reason that brought her to this same table, not a sentence laid upon her by another, but a promise she laid upon herself in the worst hour of an illness, now more than a year behind her. The road treats both reasons the same, she thinks. It asks the same tired feet of a penitent knight as of a grateful widow, and offers, in return, the same plain pottage and the same borrowed straw. The fire burns lower. One by one, the travellers rise, murmur their good nights, and make their way toward the rows of straw pallets, leaving the hall, by degrees, to quiet. A bell sounds somewhere beyond the wall, slow and solemn, marking the last office of the monk's day. Compline, Brother Osmond had called it earlier, the final prayer before the great silence of the night begins. Marjorie, not yet fully asleep, hears it faintly through the hospice wall, and beneath it, fainter still, the low murmur of voices, chanting something she cannot make out clearly. A thread of candlelight passes, briefly, along the base of the shuttered window. Monks, she guesses, moving in procession from the church, back toward their own quarters. Their day folding closed exactly as it has folded closed every night for centuries in this same stone yard. Will's breathing has settled, at last, into something steadier than the ragged catch of the road, whether from the rest or the binding on his foot, or simply the warmth of the fire, Marjorie cannot say. Thomas is already deeply asleep, his weathered face, in the last dying firelight, entirely at peace. Marjorie lies still, listening to the last of the chant fade into silence beyond the wall, and to the fire settling slowly into embers, and to nothing else at all. No wind tonight, no rattling shutter, only the deep, held quiet of a house built, centuries ago, expressly for this purpose, to let tired travellers rest. The night passes without incident, the fire burning down to a faint red glow by the small hours, the row of straw pallets holding its sleeping travellers in the same rough peace it has held countless others before them. Somewhere near dawn, Will stirs, coughs once, softly, and settles again without waking fully, his bound foot still propped a little apart from the rest of him. Marjorie wakes only briefly, once, to the far-off sound of a bell marking some early office of the monk's unbroken round, and drifts back into sleep before she has properly registered it at all. By the time full morning comes, the fire is cold ash, and a thin grey light is finding its way in around the edges of the shutter. The hospice lies quiet a while longer, its guests still sleeping, the abbey beyond the wall already well into whatever early hour its own bells have called it to, entirely indifferent to the pilgrims resting, for one more short while, beneath its roof. And so we leave them there, resting a little longer beneath a borrowed roof. But the road is long, and there is more of it still ahead. Let's follow the company a little further into what a medieval pilgrimage was really like, toward the hardest stretch of all, where the road begins, at last, to climb. No need to sit up, just keep listening. Some weeks further on, the gentle country of the lowlands has given way, by slow and almost unnoticed degrees, to something harder. The road climbing now between steep grey slopes, the air thinning and sharpening with a cold that has nothing gentle left in it at all. The company has thinned as well. Some fellow travellers turned aside toward other destinations weeks ago. Others, daunted by rumours of the crossing ahead, chose to winter in a lowland town rather than risk the pass before spring. Marjorie, Thomas, and Will remain together, joined now by a small handful of others, bound, like them, for the same crossing. Thomas has grown quieter these last days, his easy stories from the evening fire replaced by a more watchful attention to the sky, the wind, the state of the track ahead. He has done this crossing before, he reminds them, more than once, and knows exactly how quickly its mood can turn. The stone track beneath their feet has grown rougher, littered in places with loose scree that shifts underfoot, patches of old dirty snow lingering in the shadowed hollows where the sun does not reach, even at midday. Will struggles more with every passing mile. The thin cold air catches at his weak lungs in a way the lowland roads never did. His cough, now a near constant companion rather than an occasional interruption, his pace slowing steadily behind the others. Marjorie finds her own breath shortened too, though less severely, the climb pulling at muscles the flat roads of France had never asked much of. Ahead of them, the track winds up and out of sight between two grey shoulders of rock, and somewhere beyond that unseen bend, Thomas tells them, lies the high hospice built long ago expressly to shelter travellers making this exact crossing, a full day's hard walking still between here and there. The company presses on, staffs finding uncertain purchase on the loose stone, breath clouding pale in the thin mountain air, the lowland world they left behind now entirely out of sight below them. The mountain crossing that Marjorie's company now faces was, for medieval pilgrims bound toward Compostela, the single hardest and most dangerous stretch of the entire road, a pass through high, exposed terrain where sudden weather, thin air, and the sheer difficulty of the terrain claimed more travellers than any stretch of the gentler lowland roads ever did. Recognizing this danger, a hospice had been founded, generations before Marjorie's own journey, at the very top of the pass. A rough stone refuge, built for the specific purpose of sheltering pilgrims attempting the crossing, staffed by monks and lay brothers whose entire calling centered on this one difficult stretch of road. The hospice kept, among its duties, the ringing of a bell through periods of thick mountain fog or heavy snowfall, its sound carrying out across the exposed high ground to guide travelers who might otherwise lose the track entirely in weather that erased every landmark at once. Winter closed the pass to all but the most desperate or foolish travelers, the snow lying deep enough in the worst months to make the crossing simply impossible. Pilgrims travelling in the shoulder seasons, as Marjorie's company now does, faced a gentler but still real version of the same danger: sudden storms, thin ice underfoot, a cold that could turn a twisted ankle or an exhausted traveller into a genuine crisis within hours. Thieves, too, were a documented danger of this stretch in earlier centuries, the isolation of the high pass making it, at various points in its long history, a favoured haunt for robbers preying on tired and poorly defended travellers. A danger diminished by Marjorie's time by the presence of the hospice and the steady traffic of pilgrims along the route, but not entirely vanished from memory. For a company like Marjorie's, an aging widow, an old palmer, and a young clerk with weak lungs, the crossing represented, more than any other stretch of the whole long road, the point at which the journey ceased to be merely tiring and became, briefly, genuinely uncertain. Pilgrims of Marjorie's century carried a fairly clear-eyed understanding of what this stretch demanded of them. Guidebooks passed hand to hand among literate travellers noted the crossing specifically, advising an early start, careful attention to weather, and, wherever possible, the company of others rather than a solitary attempt. None of this guidance removed the danger entirely. It only meant that danger, on this stretch more than most, was expected rather than come upon by surprise. The hospice itself kept a small store of dry firewood, spare blankets, and simple provisions set aside specifically for travellers arriving in poor condition, a standing readiness, maintained across generations of the brothers who served there, for exactly the kind of trouble Marjorie's company does not yet know is only a few hours ahead of them. The track climbs on ahead of them now, narrowing between close grey crags, the wind picking up in fitful gusts that carry, faintly, what might be the first cold suggestion of snow not yet fallen. The mist closes in gradually through the middle part of the day, thickening from a faint haze to something that swallows the track only a few dozen paces ahead of them, muffling sound, blurring the grey shapes of the crags on either side into vague, featureless suggestions of rock. Thomas takes the lead without discussion, his pace slower now, more deliberate, his staff testing the ground ahead of each step before he commits his weight to it. Marjorie follows close behind, her own staff finding a similar rhythm, the mist pressing cold and damp against her face, tasting faintly of stone and old snow. Will falls further back, his breath coming in short, effortful catches, each step now visibly costing him more than the last. They walk for what feels, in the mist's disorientating grey sameness, like a very long while, though Thomas assures them, when Marjorie asks, that they have covered perhaps only half the distance to the hospice at the top. A distant sound reaches them, faint and irregular through the mist, a bell, its tone flat and metallic, ringing somewhere ahead and above, exactly as Thomas had described. He lifts his head at the sound, gets his bearing from it, and adjusts their course very slightly, following the sound the way a sailor might follow a lighthouse's beam through fog. The bell continues its slow, patient tolling as they climb, growing gradually less faint, a single unbroken thread of sound holding the whole scattered, mist-blind company together on the invisible track. Will falters badly not long after the bell first reaches them, stopping abruptly on the track, one hand braced against a boulder, his chest heaving in a fit of coughing that leaves him, for a long moment, unable to draw a proper breath at all. Marjorie turns back at once, and Thomas, a moment after her, the two of them reaching him, just as his legs seem about to give way beneath him. They ease him down onto a flat shelf of rock at the trackside, Marjorie unfastening the neck of his tunic, Thomas rubbing warmth into hands gone cold and faintly blue at the fingertips. "The air," Thomas says quietly, not alarmed, but plainly serious. "It thins as you climb, bad for a weak chest. We've seen this before, on this same crossing, with other men." Will's breathing steadies, slowly, over several long minutes, though the effort of it leaves him pale and shaking, his earlier stubborn silence about his own condition, finally, visibly, spent. "I can walk," he manages at last, though his voice carries none of its usual certainty. "You'll walk slower," Thomas says, not unkindly, "and we'll walk with you." They rise, eventually, and continue, their pace now set entirely by Will's laboured breathing, rather than by the track or the weather, Marjorie on one side of him and Thomas on the other, ready to catch him should his legs falter again. The bell continues ahead of them, patient and unhurried, marking a destination that feels, for the first time since the crossing began, genuinely uncertain to reach. They reach the hospice at last, as the light is beginning, faintly, to fail. A low, thick-walled building of piled grey stone, squat and unlovely, built for endurance rather than any beauty, smoke rising thin and grey from a chimney into the mist. A lay brother meets them at the door, unsurprised by the state of them, and helps Marjorie and Thomas half carry Will across the threshold into a warm, smoke-hazed room, already holding a handful of other travellers gathered close around a large central hearth. Will is settled near the fire, wrapped in a rough blanket, and given, after a while, a cup of hot broth that the lay brother says is kept always ready here, precisely for travellers arriving in exactly this condition. Colour returns to his face slowly, as the broth and the warmth do their work, his breathing easing by degrees into something closer to normal, though the fright of the last hour lingers visibly in his eyes. Thomas sits close by, watching him with the same watchful calm he has carried since the crossing began, saying little now that the immediate danger has passed. Marjorie finds her own hands are shaking slightly, only now, once there is nothing more urgent to do than sit and wait for Will's breathing to settle fully. The lay brother explains, unprompted, that the bell is rung on every day the mist comes down thick enough to hide the track, and has done so, by his own account, for longer than anyone now living at the hospice can say, a plain, unglamorous duty, repeated day after day, that has, this particular evening, brought 3 exhausted strangers safely to a fire. The other travellers gathered at the hearth this evening are, Marjorie notices, a smaller and quieter company than the crowded refectory of the lowland abbey, a merchant's servant leading a string of pack mules, 2 Spanish pilgrims returning already from the shrine, a lone friar wrapped in a cloak too thin, by the look of it, for the thin mountain cold. All of them, whatever their errand, share the same unspoken understanding of exactly what this particular stretch of road can cost a careless or unlucky traveller. The lay brother moves quietly between them, refilling cups of broth, adding wood to the fire without being asked, the same plain, unhurried competence Brother Osmond had shown at the lowland abbey, adapted here to a harder and lonelier post. Outside, the mist presses grey and featureless against the small shuttered windows, and within, the fire burns steady and warm, and Will, wrapped in his rough blanket, finally, gratefully, closes his eyes. Will sleeps deeply that night, propped close by the hospice fire, his breathing at last settled into something even and untroubled. Marjorie lies nearby on a straw pallet borrowed from the hospice stores, listening to the wind worrying at the shutters, to the low murmur of other travellers settling for the night around the same shared hearth. Thomas sits up a while longer than the rest, watching the fire, saying little, though Marjorie notices, before sleep finally takes her, that his eyes rest often and carefully on Will's sleeping form. Somewhere beyond the thick stone walls, the bell has fallen silent at last, its work done for one more day, the mist outside deepening into full night, indifferent now to travellers safely gathered indoors. Morning brings, at last, a break in the mist, pale, thin sunlight finding its way down between the crags, the track ahead visible now for the first time in what feels like days. Will wakes stronger than he slept, his colour better, his breathing steadier, though Thomas insists, and the lay brother agrees, that a second night at the hospice would do him no harm at all. They stay the extra day, Will resting fully by the fire, while Marjorie and Thomas walk a short way out along the beginning of the descent, testing the ground, watching the mist thin further with each passing hour. By the third morning, Will is strong enough to walk, and the company sets out together down the far side of the pass, the track descending now rather than climbing, the air, with every mile, growing perceptibly warmer and gentler around them. Behind them, the high hospice and its patient bell fall slowly out of sight, the worst of the crossing now, at last, behind all three of them. And so we leave the mountains behind us, and the three of them descending safely into gentler country. But the road is long, and there is more of it yet to walk. Let's follow them a little further into what a medieval pilgrimage was really like, toward, at last, the shrine itself. No need to sit up, just keep listening. Weeks later, on a stretch of open, rolling country, still some hours short of the city itself, the company crests a low rise, and the towers of the cathedral appear, for the first time, on the far horizon. Marjorie stops walking entirely for a long moment, her staff still in her hand, simply looking at the distant grey shape of the towers, pale against a soft afternoon sky. Other pilgrims on this same rise, she notices, are reacting more openly, some kneeling where they stand, some weeping quietly, the sight of the towers apparently working on them the way months of walking alone had not quite managed to. Marjorie's own reaction is quieter, held mostly inward, a slow, settling recognition that the distance she set out to cover all those months ago from a small English village is at last, genuinely, nearly covered. Thomas stands beside her, unsurprised by any of it, having seen this same rise and these same towers on earlier journeys of his own, though even he, she notices, grows a little quieter than usual. Will looks longest of all, his weak lungs finally rested enough, after the mountain crossing, to draw a full, unhurried breath as he takes in the sight. They walk on, after a while, down from the rise and into the last stretch of gently rolling country before the city itself, the towers sinking briefly out of sight behind nearer hills before reappearing, larger each time as the road winds them steadily closer. By evening, the outer buildings of the city itself begin to close in around the road. Modest houses first, then shops, then, at last, the press of pilgrims from every direction of Europe crowding the streets nearest the cathedral, a noise and bustle none of the three has encountered since leaving England behind so many months before. The city Marjorie now enters had grown, over centuries, almost entirely around the shrine at its centre, a modest settlement transformed, generation by generation, by the steady arrival of pilgrims from every corner of Christian Europe, all drawn by the same report, that the bones of an apostle rested here, and that the journey to them was worth the making. Streets nearest the cathedral had adapted themselves entirely to this purpose. Stalls lined the approach, selling the small lead and pewter badges that marked a completed pilgrimage, scallop shells chiefly, gathered by the thousand from the nearby coast, and sold openly to travellers eager for proof of the distance they had covered. Inns and hospices crowded close around the precinct, some grand, most modest, all doing steady trade on the constant flow of arrivals. English, French, German, travellers from lands further still, each carrying their own reasons, their own vows, their own long roads behind them. Verger Aldous, a tall, gaunt man well into his 50s, oversees a portion of the daily flood of pilgrims into the cathedral itself, his manner solemn but not unkind, long accustomed to the particular mixture of exhaustion and awe that marks nearly every face passing through the great west door. The scale of the crowd surprises Marjorie more than almost anything else on the whole long journey. After months on quiet roads, with, at most, a handful of fellow travellers, the sheer press of humanity here, all converging on the same single point, feels almost overwhelming. And yet the crowd itself carries a strange, shared calm. Everyone here, whatever tongue they speak, understands exactly what has brought everyone else, and there is little of the jostling impatience of an ordinary market crowd, more the settled patience of people who have already walked further than most will ever walk again in their lives, and can therefore afford, now, at the very last stretch, a little quiet. The city's economy had long since organized itself entirely around this steady tide of arrivals. Bakers kept their ovens working longer hours than an ordinary town of similar size would ever require. Cobblers did brisk trade mending the worn soles of travellers who had walked, in many cases, the better part of 1,000 miles to reach this one street. Even the local clergy, beyond the cathedral's own considerable staff, found steady work, hearing the confessions of pilgrims eager to arrive at the shrine itself in a state of grace. Marjorie, Thomas, and Will moved through the crowded streets together one final time, the cathedral towers now looming directly above them, close enough at last to see, clearly, the details of stone carved centuries before any of them were born. They pass beneath the great west door together, and the noise of the crowded street falls away almost at once, swallowed by the sheer scale of the space within, a nave rising far above them into shadow, pillar after grey stone pillar, marching away into a dimness broken only by the warm, scattered points of hundreds of candles. Marjorie has never in her life stood inside a building of this size. The parish church at Vistanton, familiar and beloved as it is, could fit, she guesses, some 20 times over into the space now stretching away above and ahead of her. The air smells of cold stone and melted wax, and something faintly sweet, drifting from incense, burned somewhere near the altar, mingling with the close, warm smell of the crowd itself, travel-worn wool, unwashed cloth, the collective smell of thousands of people who have walked a very long way to stand exactly here. Pilgrims kneel in clusters along the length of the nave, some weeping openly, some simply still, heads bowed, lips moving in prayer, too quiet to carry beyond their own small space. Ahead, past the crowd, past the pillars, a raised and gilded shrine catches what candlelight reaches it, gleaming faintly gold against the surrounding grey stone. The resting place, Thomas murmurs beside her, unnecessarily, since she already knows, of the apostle whose distant shrine has shaped the last 5 months of her life. Will stands very still beside her, his lips moving silently, his weak chest, for once, entirely forgotten in the moment. Marjorie finds she cannot, for a long moment, move any closer at all, only stand, at the edge of the crowd, taking in the sheer improbable fact of having arrived, finally, after everything, at the one place this entire journey was always aimed toward. The tradition surrounding this shrine reached back, by Marjorie's time, many centuries. The discovery of the apostles' relics, reported, according to the accounts pilgrims like her carried with them, in the early years of the 9th century, and the shrine itself grown, in the centuries since, into one of the 3 or 4 most important pilgrimage destinations in the whole of Christian Europe. The scallop shell had become, somewhere along that long history, the shrine's particular emblem, gathered from the nearby Atlantic coast in vast numbers and worn by returning pilgrims as unmistakable proof of where they had been, a badge recognized by Marjorie's century in towns and villages across the length of Europe. Pilgrims came, as they had always come, for a wide range of private reasons: thanksgiving, penance, hoped-for healing, simple devotion, the shrine itself making little distinction between a merchant's widow honoring a fever-bed vow and a knight walking off a confessor's sentence. On the greatest feast days, the cathedral was known to fill entirely, its vast space packed edge to edge with pilgrims, and on such occasions a great vessel of incense was swung high above the crowd on ropes, filling the whole soaring nave with fragrant smoke, as much, some said, to mask the close, travel-worn smell of so vast a gathering as for any purely devotional purpose, though few pilgrims, caught up in the sight of it, thought much about the practical reason at the time. Marjorie's own arrival falls on no such great feast day, an ordinary evening, the crowd substantial but not overwhelming, the shrine itself lit only by its usual scatter of votive candles rather than any special display. She finds, oddly, that she prefers it this way, a quieter arrival, without spectacle, that leaves room for the plain private fact of 5 months walking finally, quietly, arriving at its end. She kneels, at last, close enough to the shrine to reach out and touch the cold stone base of it, and finds, once there, that she has almost nothing left to say. The fever-bed vow, the promise made in the worst hour of a January illness, a 1.5 years gone, has carried her this entire distance without her needing, until this exact moment, to put it fully into words. Now, kneeling, she simply says it, quietly, to herself as much as to anything else, a plain thanks, for a fever survived, for a road walked safely, for two companions found along the way who had made an impossible distance merely difficult instead. Tears come, unexpectedly and without much drama, more relief than grief, and she lets them fall without embarrassment, unremarkable among the many other quietly weeping pilgrims kneeling near her in the candlelight. A little further along the shrine, Will kneels too, his own prayer, Marjorie guesses, carrying his own hoped-for cure, his weak lungs, his long private fear of what winter after winter of this cough might eventually cost him. Thomas kneels last of the three, briefly, his own prayer shorter than either of theirs. The practiced brevity of a man for whom this particular gesture, however sincere, is no longer entirely new. The candles around the shrine burn steady and countless, small warm points of light against the vast cool dark of the surrounding stone, each one, Marjorie imagines, lit by some other pilgrim's own private thanks or plea, an accumulated weight of 5 centuries of exactly this same gesture, repeated night after night in this exact spot. She thinks, kneeling there, of Father Oldhelm sprinkling holy water over her bowed head at the low church door in Wistanton, of the small crowd at the churchyard gate, of the worn coin he pressed into her palm with the words, "For the shrine, not for the road." The coin has long since gone toward bread and lodging, spent somewhere on the French roads many weeks ago. What she owed the shrine itself, she understands now, was never really the coin at all. She stays kneeling a long while after her own words are finished, simply present in the candlelight, in no hurry at all, for the first time in 5 months, to be anywhere else. The cathedral empties only slowly through the evening, a scattering of pilgrims choosing, as Marjorie now chooses, to keep a private vigil near the shrine well into the night, rather than seek out a bed at once. She sits, eventually, on the cold stone floor near the base of a great pillar, her staff laid across her lap, watching the candles burn lower and lower around the shrine ahead of her. Will sits nearby, his breathing easy in the still, cool air of the nave, his own prayer, whatever shape it finally took, apparently spent for now. The vast space holds a particular quality of silence that Marjorie has not encountered anywhere else on the entire road. Not empty, exactly, but full of something held very still. Hundreds of small candle flames, the only movement in an otherwise motionless dark. Her knees ache faintly against the cold stone. She does not move. Dawn finds a fresh wave of pilgrims arriving for the first Mass of the day, the cathedral filling again, gently, with quiet movement and murmured prayer. Marjorie, stiff from the long night's vigil, rises with the others, attends the Mass in near silence, and afterward, outside in the cathedral precinct, finally purchases, from a stall doing brisk trade in the morning light, a single pewter badge in the shape of a scallop shell. She fastens it with careful hands to the brim of her travelling hat, where it will stay, she supposes, for the whole length of the road still ahead of her, the road home. Thomas, she learns that same morning, intends to press on a while further, toward another smaller shrine he has long meant to visit, and Will, his own badge already earned and fastened beside her own hat's twin, plans a few more days' rest in the city before starting back. For now, the three of them sit together a final morning in the cathedral precinct, the towers rising quiet and familiar above them, the long distance behind all of them finally, at last, complete. And so we leave them there a while longer, resting in the shadow of the shrine. But there is one more stretch of road left to walk tonight, the longest one, in its own quiet way. Let's follow Marjorie a little further into what a medieval pilgrimage was really like, as she turns, at last, toward home. No need to sit up, just keep listening. A few mornings later, Marjorie says her farewells at the cathedral gate, first to Thomas, who presses her hand warmly and turns his own staff toward a smaller shrine still further south, his easy confidence undimmed by the many miles still ahead of him. Then to Will, whose cough, though not entirely gone, troubles him less now than it did before the mountain crossing, and who intends a few more days' rest before starting the long road back himself. She walks out from the city alone this final stretch of morning, her scallop badge fixed to her hat brim, the towers of the cathedral shrinking slowly behind her, exactly as the church tower of Wistanton once shrank ahead of her, all those months before. The road home, she finds within the first few days, feels different from the road out. Not easier, exactly. The same hills and the same weather, waiting in the same order, but carried now by a settled purpose that the outward road, for all its resolve, never quite possessed. She is, for the first time on this whole journey, walking towards something familiar rather than away from it, and finds the thought itself a kind of quiet company on the empty stretches where no other traveller happens to fall in beside her. The badge at her hat brim proves its worth almost immediately. An innkeeper, 2 days out from the city, seeing it, waves off a portion of her usual fee, murmuring something about the custom of the house regarding returning pilgrims. Marjorie accepts the kindness with the same plain gratitude she has learned, over 5 months of road, to accept most things, without excessive thanks, without much comment, simply taking what the day offers and walking on. The weather has turned, she notices, somewhere in the weeks she spent reaching the shrine. The fields she passes now carry the first low gold of early autumn, the light softer and more slanting than the high summer glare she walked through on the way out. The homeward journey of a medieval pilgrim carried its own particular character, distinct from the outward road, in ways that had less to do with geography than with what the traveller now carried with them. A returning pilgrim wearing a recognized badge, Marjorie's scallop-shell chief among them, could expect, as she now discovers for herself, a measure of goodwill along the road that an ordinary traveller could not claim. Innkeepers, aware of the hardship already survived and the modest means most pilgrims carried by the return leg of their journey, often discounted their usual charges. Villagers along well-travelled pilgrim roads had, over generations, absorbed a quiet custom of small charity toward the badge-wearing traveler passing through. The return journey also, for most pilgrims, moved somewhat faster than the outward one. The uncertainty that had slowed the first journey, unfamiliar roads, unknown distances, the private nervousness of a traveler who has never before attempted anything of this scale, had, by the time of the return, mostly resolved itself into simple, confident habit. A pilgrim who had once needed a full day to cover a stretch of road often found, walking the same stretch homeward, that the distance passed more easily, the body by now thoroughly accustomed to the daily rhythm of the long march. Not every pilgrim, of course, made the full return journey at all. Some fell ill and were buried in towns far from home. Some, having reached the shrine, chose to press on towards some further destination rather than turn back at all. Marjorie's own small company scattered exactly this way at the cathedral gate. Thomas onward to a further shrine, Will lingering behind to rest, Marjorie alone, at least for now, on the road that would carry her home. There was a quiet, recognized custom, too, among returning pilgrims, of carrying word home for others, a message for a family whose son had settled unexpectedly in some town along the road, a small token purchased at the shrine on behalf of a neighbor too old or too poor to make the journey themselves. Marjorie carries, in her scrip, a second small badge, bought at the same stall as her own, meant for a bedridden widow 2 doors down from her own house in Wistanton, who had asked her, before she left, to remember her at the shrine if the distance ever allowed it. She does not mind the solitude of this stretch as much as she once feared she might. The road itself, after so many months, has become familiar enough to keep its own kind of company, and the badge at her hat brim carries, in its own quiet way, the memory of everyone she walked beside to earn it. The road retraces itself in these early weeks of the homeward journey almost exactly, the same wayside cross at the same crossroads, weathered no differently than she remembers it from months before. The same stretch of open field where Thomas first told her of Rome, the same hedge where, one long ago feeling night, 3 tired travellers built a small fire and slept beneath a scattering of cold stars. She passes, on the 4th day out from the mountains, the high hospice where the bell had guided them safely through the mist, and pauses there a night, greeted this time not as a frightened, exhausted arrival, but as a familiar returning face, the same lay brother recognizing with evident pleasure the scallop badge at her hat brim. She tells him, briefly, of Will's recovery in that same firelit room, and the lay brother nods, unsurprised, having seen the same fright and the same recovery play out countless times before, in exactly this spot. The descent from the pass, on the homeward side, feels shorter than she remembers the climb, whether because the ground genuinely covers faster going down, or simply because her own legs have by now forgotten what it once felt like to find this same stretch difficult, she cannot entirely say. Below the mountains, the gentler country of France opens out again exactly as it did before, fields and hedgerows and modest wayside villages. each one now carrying a faint, familiar echo of a place already passed once, going the other direction many weeks earlier. Marjorie walks on through it at a pace that has become, by now, entirely her own. Not fast, not laboured, simply steady, the small daily knock of her staff against the road, as natural to her, after 5 months, as her own heartbeat. Some weeks further on, the road brings her at last back to the coast, and to the crossing that will carry her home across the narrow sea to England. The passage proves calmer than the one that carried her out, the water flat and grey beneath an overcast sky, other travellers aboard the same small vessel, merchants, a handful of other pilgrims, a family returning from some errand of their own. Marjorie stands near the rail for much of the crossing, watching the coast of France recede slowly behind the ship, and finds herself thinking, without any great weight of feeling, simply that this same stretch of water once carried her the other way, a traveller then who had no real notion what the following months would ask of her. The English coast rises, eventually, pale and low along the horizon ahead, and something in her chest loosens slightly at the sight of it, a small, quiet unclenching she had not fully noticed was there until the moment it released. She lands by early afternoon and finds the English roads, familiar in a way the roads of France and Spain never quite became however many months she walked them, easier still to cover, a language she need not strain to follow, a countryside whose shapes and customs she has known her whole life. The last stretch of road, from the coast toward Wistleton, will take, she reckons, perhaps another 8 or 9 days at her now well-practiced pace. A short distance, by the measure of everything already behind her, and yet the longest 8 or 9 days of the entire journey, in the particular way that the final stretch of any long road always seems to stretch a little further than its actual measure warrants. The last few days of the road home passed through country Marjorie knew well even before this journey began, lanes she walked as a girl, church towers she could once have named from a single glance at their outline against the sky. The fields carry the full gold of late autumn now, stubble left standing after the harvest, a scattering of rooks working the turned earth for whatever the ploughs have uncovered. She is recognized, on the second to last day, by a carter she has known for years, hauling wool toward the very market town her own late husband once traded in, and he stares a long moment at her sun-browned face and travel-worn cloak, and the small pewter badge fixed to her hat before recognition finally breaks across his features. He offers her a place on his cart for the last stretch of the day's road, and she accepts, gratefully, her feet, after 5 months of walking, still perfectly capable, but glad enough of the rest. He asks her, as the cart rattles on, what the whole journey was actually like, and she finds she has no single answer ready, only fragments, offered slowly, the mountain pass, the bell in the mist, the vast candle-lit shrine, 2 companions found, and in Thomas's case, not yet seen again. He nods along without fully understanding any of it, the way anyone who has not walked such a road themselves inevitably fails to fully grasp its shape, and she does not press the telling any further than he seems able to follow. He asks, too, after her health, plainly curious whether the whole long errand had done what the fever-bed vow had hoped it might. She considers the question longer than she considered most of his others. She has not been ill again, not once, in all the months of walking, though whether that is the shrine's doing, or simply the plain good fortune of an ordinary body holding up under an extraordinary amount of walking, she does not pretend to know for certain. It seems to her an ungracious kind of question to press too closely. Some debts are better simply paid than audited. The last light of the day is fading by the time the cart crests a familiar low-rise, and there, ahead in the gathering dusk, stands the squat stone tower of Wistonson's parish church, exactly where it has always stood. The cart rattles down the final stretch of lane into the village itself, past houses Marjorie has known her entire life, smoke rising from familiar chimneys into the darkening sky. Father Aldhelm, she learns within moments of climbing down from the cart, is already hurrying toward her from the direction of the church, alerted by some quick-footed child who ran ahead the moment word of her return reached the lane. He takes both her hands in his lined old face creased with plain, uncomplicated relief, and says very little beyond her name, repeated once, softly, as though confirming to himself that the sight before him is real. A small crowd gathers, much as it did the morning she left, though warmer now, less solemn. Neighbors drawn out of their houses by the news, a few reaching to touch the badge at her hat brim, as though it might tell them, by touch alone, something of the distance it represents. The church bell begins, unprompted, to ring, not a full peal, just a few strokes. Father Aldhelm's own doing, she suspects, a small private acknowledgment rung out into the darkening village. Her own house stands exactly as she left it, the shop front still shuttered, her cousin having kept faithful watch over it through the whole 5 months of her absence. She unlocks the door herself, her key finding the lock by long habit rather than by any need to look, and steps into a house that smells, faintly, of dust and disuse, and, beneath that, still, unmistakably, of home. She lights a fire in the cold hearth, with hands that have, by now, built 100 such fires along 100 different roadsides, and hangs her scallop badge on a small hook beside the mantel, where it will stay, she decides, for the rest of her life. The fire catches slowly, then steadies, throwing its familiar warm light across a room she has pictured, more nights than she could easily count, from 100 different straw pallets and borrowed firesides along the long road behind her. She sits before it a long while, her staff leaned in its old place by the door, the badge catching the firelight faintly from its hook by the mantel, and for the first time in 5 months, there is, at last, absolutely nowhere else she needs to walk to. And so the night goes on, as it has for centuries. The fire burns low, the village sleeps, and perhaps, by now, so do you. If you're still awake, that's perfectly fine. There's nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to do. The archive will be here tomorrow night, as always. Sleep well.